When it comes to unused content in The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, a few basic things come to mind. There are the weapons from the prologue, like the Message Not Found sword, and Zelda's torch. There's some text carried over from Breath of the Wild, like this unused statue dialogue, and there are a couple of cut items here and there too, like unused types of Zonite and Ancient Heroes aspect pieces. But did you know the game is had far more interesting hidden away? The entirely unused dungeons exist in the game's code? Yep, as found by DT13269 on the Tears of the Kingdom Data Collection and Research Discord server, there are actually unfinished versions of all 6 of the game's main dungeons hidden within the source code. These dungeons are all named Large Dungeon Theme and are on separate maps from the rest of the game. So what are these files? Why do these versions even exist? Well, it all has to do with how Tears of the Kingdom handles dungeons, or more precisely, how it used to handle dungeons during its development. In the final game, the dungeons aren't on separate maps. No, they're actually part of the main overworld and load seamlessly when you approach them. That's why a place like the Water Temple can be left at any time, and why things like NPCs and Ultram builds can be carried in just fine. The thing is, however, that's not how it used to work. No, in development, the dungeons used to exist on separate maps, like how the Divine Beast did in Breath of the Wild. Presumably, the devs used Breath of the Wild as a base, and only realised the dungeons could be part of the main map part way through development. So the unfinished maps got left in, and data miners found them months later. But what's different here? What interesting details these maps have that the final ones don't? Let's find out. Starting with a few general differences, most notably the obvious fact on separate maps from the main overworld. This means things like the Trail Medallion are disabled, and the rest of the world isn't rendered around the dungeon either. So these areas are just floating boxes and rooms in a creepy blank void. There are also no maps from either. Presumably, these weren't created when these files were made, so the only things the map shows are a blank overlay on top of central Hyrule, plus the floors of the dungeon. At the same time though, some functionality was left in. You can still press X to leave the dungeon map and access a regular map here, so that piece of functionality will set up correctly with these areas. And the same goes for waypoints too. In the dungeons with named locations, like the Lightning Temple and Hyrule Castle, the game will indeed display the name of the room once you enter it as expected. So map wise, it's a mixed bag. Some stuff is clearly unfinished, some stuff is mostly complete. What's not complete though is the lighting. The base isn't any of it, since for these dungeons, any real lighting setup per se. They're lit from top to bottom, with the highest part of the map being bright and the lowest part being darkness. It looks incredibly strange and reminds me of custom levels for games like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and Super Mario Odyssey. These areas are also connected to equivalents in the final game too. For example, if you visit the Water Temple early on, the area will be polluted like it is in the main game. It will also add the right icon to a map despite never having gone there. But you can't finish the dungeons in this state. The sages that accompany you don't appear in these dungeons, meaning you can't activate the terminals. You also can't beat the bosses either. Once you take off half his health bar, the cutscene will glitch up and Link will be placed where the actual boss room would be in the map. This unloads the boss in question and restores them full health by the time you reach them again. Ascend doesn't work either. For whatever reason, every single ceiling in these areas is set to be impossible to ascend through, meaning you can't use it except with hover stones and contraptions. So there's no way to make progress in any of these except Hyrule Castle. So that's the basic stuff here. On to some details. Starting with the Wind Temple, since that's the first dungeon everyone visits in the final game. In this form, it seems to be about 70 to 80% complete, since while the level geometry is all intact and the constructs in expected locations, there are a lot of minor things that don't seem to be added yet. Like, say, the giant vortex that usually surrounds a ship, making it seem rather empty compared to the final game. It's also a bit hotter too, since while you need 2 levels of cold resistance to survive in the final game, you only need 1 in this version. Perhaps this version didn't take place in Hebra back then. Either way, onto the fire temple where the lighting issues get much more severe. That's because this dungeon is significantly more vertical in its design than the wind temple was, and the differences between each floor go incredibly noticeable as a result, with the ground one getting the worst of it. There's so little light down here that the floor is basically invisible, and the area makes the darkest parts of the lightning temple look like a brightly lit movie studio by comparison. It's also where the void setup doesn't do the area much justice either. Without the depth surrounding the dungeon, it just feels like a bunch of buildings floating in the middle of nowhere with things like pillars, rocks and platforms either in the void or cut off at the base. It's a specially comical entrance bridge which literally just ends in a sheer drop into the abyss. Yeah, it feels like this dungeon and the lightning temple were when Nintendo realised the standalone map thing wasn't the best way to go about it. Meanwhile, actual unused elements are surprisingly few and far between. The enemies are in place, the puzzles are in place, and the geometry is one-to-one with the final game. As a result, the only things seemingly missing are the lava that surrounds much of the area, plus the ceiling of the depths itself. Interestingly, there's actually a roof on top of the fire temple here with full collision and glitchy texture mapping, meaning there was a chance you were meant to go here at some point during development. Also interestingly, this area exists in the final game too, just above the depth ceiling. There are also a few enemy and item differences as well. Most notably, the enemies don't drop Zonite in this version of the map. No, they drop the same items as they do on the surface instead. They also don't have appropriate weapons either. No, they have wooden ones instead of Zonite ones. Wait, what? Isn't this area supposed to be incredibly hot? Like, how do they not burn? Well, as it turns out, because this dungeon doesn't actually have the scorching climate the final one does. You can just explore in whatever clothing you like, using whatever items you like, and everything will be just fine. So for a fire temple, it sure isn't very hot. And nor are the treasures appropriate either. No, the opals return since many chests don't have contents preset for them. I guess that water themed gem doesn't really fit here, does it? Either way, that's the fire temple. Onto the water temple now. Which is perhaps the least change of the lot. There are differences, but they're very minor, and in one case, literally invisible. Like the muck, in the final version, it's visible. In this version though, that's not the case. So, it's very easy to land on the stuff accidentally, and very annoying to navigate. The other differences are the item ones. The constructs have rusty weapons instead of Zonite ones, and the treasure chests have opals, because they're not set to have any items in them. Either way, there's not much to discuss, so let's move on. So that brings us to the Lightning Temple, and this one is the most interesting of the lot. Since for starters, it's now a giant floating building in the middle of nowhere. If the Fire Temple looked jarring, the Lightning Temple looks even more ridiculous. But it does have its differences right off the bat though, like how the architecture seems a bit different in this version, or how the ore deposits seem to all be gone. And we also get to learn a few interesting things about event flags too. For example, if you go here early, before making the Lightning Temple appear, the pink glowing orb on the front of the building is nowhere to be seen, and nor are the Gibdo hives. So, right off the bat, we learn the Lightning Temple doesn't have these elements by default, and are added in once it rises up from the sands. We also get to see how Queen Gibdo copes with this strange setting too, since the initial battle outside the temple can take place here too. It's interesting to say the least. For one thing, she's usually trapped on a tiny bridge outside the temple, since the sand around isn't rendered at all. Wait, does she even usually appear on a bridge at all? Huh, I guess not. Either way, her AI falls apart here. Since she can't circle around Link, she just walks back and forth from the bridge until attacking. And when she does try to attack, the result could send her off the bridge instead. Either way, upon beating her, cutscene gets messed up. And we respawn in a weird place. One reload later, and we're in the temple where things are very different. Most notably, the lights. Yeah, as we said earlier, these temples don't have the proper lighting system set up, so they're all lit up in the most simplistic way possible. And in the Lightning Temple's case, that means it's fully lit up from start to finish. Either way, it's a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, this gives us the best look at the temple's architecture outside of seeing in a model viewer. At the same time though, it also makes it look like a theme park attraction rather than a haunted tomb. If it's placed in the atmosphere, it's been completely obliterated here. Either way, the Lightning Temple has its differences and are pretty noticeable compared to those in the other dungeons. But we don't just have versions of the temples here. No, with an early version of Hyrule Castle too. And this one is a strange beast in comparison to said temples. If you go there once Crisis at Hyrule Castle resumes, 90% of the quests will actually work fine in this version. Zelda will appear in each location, the monster forces will be summoned.
Link, I am waiting for you.
And the cutscene for Phantom Ganon will play as expected too.
At last. I have been waiting for you to arrive. Now, Link, there is something here I want to show you. What do you think? Hyrule Castle, perfect and glorious. Does it awaken memories? Memories of our time here? Well, really take in every detail. After all, this place will be the last thing you ever see.
The fabled swordsman who endured my corruption, who has persisted in slaughtering my servants. Interesting. How is it that you survived my attack? It must have been that wretched arm. No matter. You will not live to see another sunrise. Did my puppet entertain you? She made it so easy to mislead you, to keep you occupied. But such an indirect approach is no longer needed. End this hero's life, my dark servant. Cut him down.
That's where things get a bit broken. You see, the game doesn't let you lead the Phantom Ganon battle by default, and this version of the castle does not have the same coordinates as the finished version. So, once the battle begins, the game will say you can't leave the area, and you'll keep falling and reappearing non-stop. However, if you use a glitch to escape the regular Phantom Ganon fight, the boss fight does work in this version. Phantom Ganon first appears when you approach the Sanctum, then after phase 1, you get warped into a throne room here and everything goes as expected. This setup also changes the post-fight cutscene too.
It seems there is more to you than the power Rauru has gifted. But not much more.
here!
Those who carry the secret stones.
Just what is this thing?
You do not recognize me. Perhaps there are limits to the knowledge the secret stones impart. You stand before Ganondorf. The foolish actions of your ancestors served only to delay my ascension. Allow me to show you, the world that was and will be again when I have been restored. Rise, my servants. Sweep over Hyrule with the power I have granted. Eliminate this kingdom and her allies. Leave no survivors. You cannot hope to escape your fate. My power will sweep across this land. You need but await the inevitable end.
Was that the Demon King we were warned about? It all really happened?
This is dire. The Demon King, the man who nearly destroyed the world. Ganondorf. With his return, everyone's in danger.
Oh, this isn't good! If that really was him, oh, we're in real trouble!
Hold on. He must not be at his full strength. Otherwise, why flee instead of finishing us off? We should return to Lookout Landing and decide what to do next. Link, you should come too.
While in the main game it has the sages entering the sanctum and Gandalf's figure looming over the room, in this version it has them appear in a void in front of a blood moon instead. Presumably you're where the cutscene should play, but the castle hasn't been loaded since this version is above Hyrule Field instead. Either way, the scene looks incredible in this context and probably works better here than it does in the final game. Still, enough about the cutscene oddities for now. What actual differences are there from the final dungeon? Well, quite a few really. Firstly, a lot of item locations haven't been finalised when this version of the map was made. As a result, there are numerous random construct bows littered about the place, usually in places more fitting weapons are found in the finished version. And enemies are different here too. Most notably, the Horriblins found in the final version's tunnel seem to be absent in this one. Maybe they were late additions too? And the enemies in the monster forces are different too, like the Hinox. In the final game, it's a black Hinox wearing iron greaves, while in this version it's a standard red one without said greaves. It also drops different weapons too, while in the final game it's the following attached to its necklace: a knight's broadsword, a knight's bow and a knight's claymore. In the earlier version it is a rusty broadsword, construct bow and rusty claymore instead, which were a lot weaker and less fitting for the area. Like the construct bows, these seem to be placeholders. Other enemies hold different weapons too. For example, the fire breath of Zalfos fought in Zelda's room are unarmed in the beta, but have gear from the knight set in the final version. The bokoblins in the first gatehouse are all low level ones rather than blue or black ones, and the silver moblin attacks in the guard's chamber is a red one with a traveller's claymore instead. Again, these are probably placeholders with the final enemy strengths and weapon choices not having been decided at this point. And that brings us to the last big change, the performance. Oh boy, the performance is terrible in this version, like some of the worst in the game. And this is very noticeable with the trees. They all pop into existence about a foot in front of Link. It's terrible, and it gets very distracting as you explore the area. Maybe that's another reason this setup was scrapped? Either way, Hyrule Castle is a very different beast here, and there's a lot of differences from the final version. But the most interesting one is still yet to come. Since we now have the Spirit Temple to talk about, the one dungeon that inspired this whole video, and this one is very special indeed. Because while in the final game there's not much to it, an entrance room, a boss arena, and an area with shops and a secret stone, in this version of the map things are completely different. For starters, it's actually a sort of mini obstacle course for the construct. You start at the top with a teleport pad near a construct and work your way down past various enemies. Floor 1 has a construct alongside a spike ball and iron pole as if to teach you the basics of combat. While floor 2 has a whole army of constructs to deal with and even more items to fuse alongside them. Then, floor 3 is the emitter to play around with, plus an ice block to get past. And the final accessible floor has ice themed enemies, which were easily taken out of a flame emitter from the last area. It's an interesting setup and seems like the start of a dungeon designed around the construct and its abilities. But it's also clearly unfinished too. There are no walls or decorations, the boss room and cutscenes don't exist at all, and the obstacles feel very thrown together without the care you'd expect in an area like this. As a result, it's basically more of a test room right now, more of a way to demonstrate the construct than something to play as a level. And this unfinishedness extends to little details too. Location names are missing, meaning a file saved in this area will be named if it takes place in Hyrule Field rather than Spirit Temple. The map is nowhere to be seen, with floors not labelled at all, and accessing the area does nothing to progress the main game. So, whatever this place was, it was clearly cut early in development. Regardless, it's a completely unused dungeon in the game and shows what the Spirit Temple could have been had the Construct Factory not been created. So yeah, those are the unfinished dungeons in Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. For the most part, they're the same as the final ones, with the geometry and puzzles remain intact. Still, bigger differences do exist, with Hyrule Castle being unfinished and the Spirit Temple being a proper dungeon rather than a boss arena. It's interesting to see and shows what could have been planned while developing Tears of the Kingdom. Regardless, thanks to the guys at Tears of the Kingdom Data Mining Research Discord for their help here, and thanks to you guys for watching the video. If you found it interesting, give the video a like, subscribe to our channel if you want to see more, then leave your thoughts in the comments below or over at the Discord server today.